There was an article I had previously looked at back in April of 2014, namely points made by Aryeh Kaplan. The post was made a while back on the Jews for Judaism page in Canada. You can find a link to the page itself in the description below. Let's dive into the points, shall we? The first point in the paper is this, quote, "Many people are fascinated by the person of Jesus. Even when they find it impossible to accept Christian theology, they still feel that they can identify with Jesus the person. They see him as someone who preached love and peace and whose life embodied the greatest ideals. When we look at Jesus in such idealized terms, many of the things done in his name seem very strange. How could the Crusaders have pillaged and destroyed entire communities in his name? How could the Inquisition have tortured people to death in the name of a man who taught that the foremost commandment was love your neighbors yourself? How are such contradictions possible? It is much less surprising that his followers did not live by Jesus' teachings when we realize that even Jesus himself did not abide by them. Christians like to present us with an idealized picture of Jesus the man, but a careful reading of the Gospels dispels this picture very quickly." Unquote. I'll tell you how the Crusades and Inquisition happened, and it can be summed up in 2 words. False Christians. One can claim to be a Christian and yet disobey Jesus himself, but that doesn't make him a Christian in sincerity and truth, but in name only. What Kaplan sets out to try and say is that Jesus was a hypocrite who violated his own teachings, and thus true Christianity is a destructive, violent religion with no mercy on mankind. But does a careful reading actually demonstrate the point that is made? We'll see. We look at the first point. It says the following, quote, "Let us look at a few examples. One of the best known teachings of Jesus is, if someone smites you on one cheek, turn the other cheek. This might have been a beautiful ideal, but Jesus himself did not live up to it. When one of the high priest's officers struck him, Jesus did not turn the other cheek at all. Instead, the gospel tells us that his response was, 'If I spoke amiss, state it in evidence at my trial. If I spoke well, then why did you smite me?' He did not meekly or quietly submit, as he himself is alleged to have preached. Throughout history, it seems that the only one who ever turned the other cheek was the Jew. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus instructed his followers, 'Love your enemies, bless those who curse you, and do good to those who hate you.' This might have been a fine lesson if Jesus himself lived up to it. But when it came to his own enemies, Jesus declared, 'Take my enemies who would not have me rule over them, bring them here, and kill them before me.'" Unquote. Kaplan actually distorts what turning the other cheek actually means. Turning the other cheek is not referring to defending yourself from false charges or making an inquiry. Christians turning the other cheek also does not mean that Christians are to have a sentimental, airy-fairy, lovey-dovey attitude to life, nor does it mean you cannot stand up for yourself. That is an abuse and misuse of the text. James M. Arlenson has made the following observation about Matthew 5:38-42. Quote, "One interpretation says that the clause is rhetorical. It is hyperbole or an obvious and intentional exaggeration, not to be taken literally. For example, Matthew 7:35 shows Jesus' use of this time-honored and effective rhetorical device, in which he says to pull a plank out of our eye before we judge. Obviously, we cannot literally have a plank in our eye, so the rhetorical interpretation of turn the other cheek is plausible. It protects the clause from being distorted and misapplied beyond recognition when it is interpreted too literally and too far. Thus, it is a little known and little appreciated fact that Jesus replied to his critics as they insulted him. He was not literally slapped until his arrest and trial, and at that time he was submitting to God's plan to die for the sins of the world. However, before then, during his 3-year ministry, he did not stand there meek and mild and silent, looking down at the ground, wishing for the verbal assaults to finish. Rather, he confronted the insults and the insulters. See almost the entire chapters of Matthew 12, Luke 20, and John 8 for examples. Or he walked away. So we should not turn the other cheek into absurd directions of absolute passivity. However, let us take the clause as if it should be put into practice, not only as a rhetorical device. Many scholars believe that taking it as written explains it more clearly as it was originally intended. Thus, at least two other main interpretations of the verse are possible: the historical, legal, and the eschatological, the end times, which can overlap. Our focus is on them for the rest of the article. Unquote. You can find this in James M. Arnoldson's article on Answering Islam called Should the State Turn the Other Cheek? Read that article for more information. Also, if you were to read the context of what Jesus is saying in Luke 19, starting from verse 11 and ending it with verse 27, we'll take a look at the text on screen. When you read it carefully, Jesus is speaking about on what will happen on the day of judgment, and that Jesus himself will judge every man individually for what they have done, and those who refuse to follow him will be executed accordingly by being thrown into the lake of fire. This is not a denial of loving your enemy, and if Jesus is God and Messiah, he has the prerogative to judge mankind for their sins, including those who deny him. Now we move on to the next point. Quote, Jesus might have preached against vindictiveness, but he did not practice as he preached when he said, I have come to the world for judgment. I may give sight to the sightless, but I will blind those who see. Some of us may have a picture of Jesus preaching love and peace, as when he said anyone who nurses anger against his brother must be brought to judgment. If he even sneers at him, he will have to answer for it in the fires of hell. The picture, however, changes rapidly when Jesus himself is put to the test. We find him declaring, Think not that I have come to send peace to the world. I come not to send peace, but the sword. Unquote. Let's read what Jesus is actually saying in context. He says, from verses 34 to 39, in the Gospel of Matthew, quote, Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household. Anyone who loves their father and mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. Unquote. In the actual context of Matthew 10:34 to 39, and also in Luke 12:49 to 53, Jesus is speaking about a metaphorical sword of division within families that will occur if someone chooses to follow him. He is saying, in essence, if you don't love me more than your family, don't follow me, because by doing so you'll have opposition from your family and friends. And Matthew 5 is a condemnation of unrighteous anger. Jesus is not violating his own principle when he is speaking about counting the cost of following him and being his disciples. Lastly, how is John 9:39 vindictive in the slightest? Let's read the context, starting from verse 35 and ending with verse 41. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, and when he found him, he said, Do you believe in the Son of Man? Who is he, sir? The man asked. Tell me so that I may believe in him. Jesus said, You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. Then the man said, Lord, I believe, and he worshipped him. Jesus said, For judgment I have come into this world so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, What? Are we blind too? Jesus said, If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now you claim you can see, your guilt remains. Unquote. Can someone enlighten me as to where any vindictiveness or revenge is present in the context? Because quite frankly, I don't see it. Now we move on to the next point. Quote, Jesus subjected anyone who dared oppose him to the most awful abuse, curses, and threats of dire punishment. When the Jews tried to defend their ancient faith, Jesus answered them by saying, You snakes, you generation of vipers, how will you escape the damnation of hell? Jesus did not limit himself to his immediate opponents such as the rabbis and the teachers. He spoke against all who dared not believe in him, branding them as outcasts subject to divine punishment. Thus we hear his pronouncement, "He who believes in the Son has everlasting life, but he who does not believe in the Son shall not see life, but shall suffer the everlasting wrath of God." He may have preached love, but it was a very restricted love. He thus said, "I surely say to you, unless a man is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God." In contrast to this, the rabbis whom Jesus hated so much did not place such limitations on God's love. It was the rabbis of the Talmud who made the statement, "The righteous of all nations have a share in the world to come." They saw God's love as available to all people and not only to the Jews. Unquote. Putting aside the issue of whether God's love applies to all people or not, the statement still begs the question as to whether the Talmud goes back to the time of Moses, which is another issue neither here nor there. Not to mention Kaplan fails to inform his audience of whom Jesus is actually speaking to. If you have Matthew 23 in front of you, read from verses 13 to 39. When one reads the context, Jesus is actually anathematizing the Pharisees and the teachers of the law in Matthew 23, not all Jews. And I hardly think that Jesus calling the Pharisees a brood of vipers is remotely being nasty, and the reason for his terminology being used of them was because they were leading the people astray into legalistic worship rather than genuine biblical worship. The Pharisees had an obligation as leaders to bring their people closer to God and lead them in worship, something they failed to do. Isaiah even labels his own people as a brood of vipers, depraved children, offspring of treachery, etc. in his own book. Is Isaiah being nasty to his people, or is he stating a fact at that given point? He's stating a fact at that given point. Furthermore, if Jesus was the Messiah, he was just in condemning those who refused his offer of salvation. Let us move on to the next point. Quote, "An even stronger statement can be found in our midrashic literature where a rabbi declares, 'I call heaven and earth as witnesses. Any individual, whether Gentile or Jew, man or woman, servant or maid, can bring the divine presence upon himself in accordance with his deeds.' The Jewish attitude towards non-Jews is most clearly expressed in King Solomon's prayer, when he says, 'When a stranger who is not of your people Israel, but comes from a distant land, turns in prayer towards his temple, then listen to his prayers.' Jesus, however, was not so broad-minded. When he sent out his 12 disciples, he charged them, 'Do not take the road to Gentile lands, and do not enter any Samaritan city. Go only to the lost sheep of Israel.' The rabbis who lived in Jesus' time taught, 'Do not despise any man.' They likewise declared, 'Even a Gentile who studies Torah is equal to a high priest.' These rabbis saw God's salvation freely available to all men. Contrast this with the terrible sentence proclaimed by Jesus, 'He who does not abide in me is thrown away like a withered branch. Some withered branches are gathered together, cast into the fire and burned.' This terrible statement was later used by the Catholic Church to justify their practice of burning non-believers at the stake." Unquote. The reason Jesus told them not to go to the Gentiles was because it wasn't time for them to go just yet. They had to go to their own people first. Furthermore, the same book in Matthew 28, Jesus says, "Go out and make disciples of all nations." As for what Jesus says in John 15, let's read, starting from verse 1 and ending with verse 17. Quote, "I am the true vine, and the Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me, as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Now remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends, for everything I learned from my Father I've made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you might go and bear fruit, fruit that will last, and so that whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you. And this is my command: love each other." Unquote. Jesus is calling his disciples for obedience, and refusal to comply would result in their judgment. Men can say the creed every Sunday, but if there is no faith and trust in Jesus that leads to an obedient life, saying the creed is merely rhetoric and no substance can be found. The Catholic Church and many other people have misused the statement which Kaplan refers to, and didn't apply the statement correctly. The text in context does not call for the killing of anyone. To further expand on this, when Jesus talks about a branch who is no good and burnt, he is talking about a person who professes to know Christ, that if they do not obey him, they will be cast aside. We move on to the next quote. Quote, "In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus preached, 'You have been previously taught to love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say this to you, love your enemies and bless those who curse you.' Jesus may have said this, but the Gospels are aflame with his own words of hatred towards those who did not accept him. Time after time, he displays the same appetite for revenge as any other mortal. One of the basic teachings of Judaism is, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. This commandment is so important that Rabbi Akiva declared that it was the fundamental principle of the Torah. Even though this is openly stated in the Torah, written over 1,000 years ago before Jesus' birth, many people still think of it as one of Jesus' teachings." Unquote. How in the world is condemnation of people refusing to accept him remotely even an appetite for revenge? That is absurd and ludicrous. There are those who I do concede that there are those who do think love thy neighbor comes from Jesus. However, it comes from the Torah, and Jesus quotes it as a response to a man's question in Mark 12:28-34. Here's the next point. Quote, "That even in explaining this commandment of love, Jesus was not above displaying his vindictiveness. The Gospel records that he was asked, 'But who is my neighbor?' Jesus replied with one of the best-known parables in the Gospels. A man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho is attacked by robbers. They plunder and beat him, leaving him half dead by the roadside. A priest comes along and sees the injured man, but he promptly crosses the road to avoid him. A Levite then happens to pass by, and he also crosses the road to avoid him. Finally, a Samaritan comes by and is touched by pity. He binds the stranger's wounds, carries him to a secure spot, and tenderly cares for him. Thus the Samaritan becomes the perfect example of the good neighbor. At first glance, this looks like a most beautiful story, but when we look beneath the surface, we see Jesus' vindictiveness only too clearly. Let us carefully note the three persons who saw the unfortunate victim. They are a priest, Cohen, a Levite, and a Samaritan. Anyone familiar with the three classes of Jews called to the Torah knows that they are Cohen, Levite, and Israelite. We would therefore expect that after the Cohen and Levite passed up the victim, the story would tell us that the third person, was an Israelite, an ordinary Jew. Instead, however, Jesus substitutes the Samaritan, a member of a tribe who have been enemies with the Jews for almost 500 years. This Samaritan then becomes the example of moral love. The priests and Levites, who were the religious leaders of the Jews, were thus downgraded, while this hated Samaritan was praised. What Jesus is implying is that every Jew, even a religious leader, is incapable of even a simple act of mercy. Even in his parable about love, Jesus was not above demonstrating his spite towards the Jewish leaders who rejected him. Good Samaritan is a byword among Christians to this day. Many churches even bear the name Church of the Good Samaritan. But Jesus' vindictiveness assured that there would be never a church with the name Church of the Good Israelite. Unquote. Now, in the context, Jesus was aware of the Jews' hatred of the Samaritans and only uses the Samaritan to demonstrate a point of how loving one's neighbor should be applied and what the Torah says regarding it. He is encouraging those in his midst that despite coming from bad stock, the Samaritan was willing to put his life on the line for the sake of the man, unlike the priest and Levite. The Jews had forgotten the principle of loving one's neighbor, and Jesus sought to correct the error through this parable. He is saying, if a Samaritan was willing to do this much for the man, you should do likewise. Whining about whether a church is called Good Samaritan or Good Jew or Good anything is nothing more than a red herring that doesn't prove Jesus is being vindictive. There's no vindictiveness when Jesus is using two Jews and a Samaritan in the parable. We now move on to the next point. Quote, Jesus was even able to be vindictive against a tree. When he found himself hungry, he was not able to restrain his two human emotions. The Gospels thus records, in the morning on his way to the city, Jesus felt hungry. Seeing a fig tree near the road, he went up to it, but found nothing on it but leaves. He said to the tree, "May you never bear fruit any more." The tree withered and died. The Gospel of Mark makes it plain that it was not even the season for figs. Did this innocent fig tree deserve such cruel punishment? It was not even the season for figs, and the tree was merely fulfilling its nature. If Jesus merely wanted to show his miraculous powers, as the Gospel seems to indicate, why did he not command the tree to bring forth fruit? Indeed, the Talmud brings a very similar incident, but with a very different ending. Rabbi Yossi's son wanted to provide his father's field hands with food. All he could find was a fig tree. But it was not the season, and the tree was bare. He cried out, fig tree, send forth your fruit, so that my father's workers may eat." The Talmud tells us that the tree produced fruit before its time, and the men were able to fill themselves. If Jesus were truly capable of miracles, he could have done the same. Instead, he chose to display his vindictiveness. Unquote. There is a reason that Jesus was cursing the fig tree. He was using the tree as a parable for the nation of Israel refusing to bear fruit, specifically the wicked among Israel and not Israel as a whole. Considering Jesus did find righteous individuals such as Nathan, who was under the fig tree. Sam Shamoun makes the following observation in his article on the fig tree. Quote, Christ came searching for what the Old Testament says Yahweh searches after, namely an indication that Israel was a fruitful tree and not barren and dry. Yet instead of finding the early fig, which would have demonstrated that Israel was spiritually alive and capable of bearing the fruit which satisfies God, Christ found the nation spiritually dead and barren. In light of Israel's spiritual barrenness, God would cut down his fig tree, his very own vine, and burn it. The following context Sam Shamoun quotes are Luke 13:6-9, Mark 12:1-9, Matthew 23:37-39, and Luke 19:41-44. This was the meaning behind Jesus' cursing of the fig tree, as a sign that God came looking for spiritual fruitfulness among his covenant people, but saw none, and would therefore bring destruction upon them. Unquote. Feel free to check out his article for more information. As I've mentioned before, Jesus did find individuals among his people who did have a love for God and did have the fruits he was looking for. Now then, let us continue with the final section. This is what it says. Quote, a primary teaching of Judaism is expressed by the psalmist many generations before Jesus. He declared, God is good to all, and his love extends over all his works. No distinction is made between Jew and Gentile. Contrast this with the following event in Jesus' career. A woman whose daughter was possessed by an unclean spirit heard of Jesus and came in, falling at his feet. She was a Gentile, a Phoenician from Syria. She begged Jesus to drive out the spirit from her daughter. Jesus replied, "Let the dogs be satisfied first. It is not right to take the children's bread and cast it to the dogs." From the context, it is obvious that the children mentioned by Jesus refer to the Jews, while the dogs refer to the Gentiles. These dogs must be satisfied with the scraps from the table. Now compare this narrow view with a teaching of the much maligned Pharisees, i.e. rabbis. They declare in the Talmud, "We are obliged to feed the Gentile poor in exactly the same manner as we feed the Jewish poor." We can bring many such contrasts between Jewish and Christian ethics. In every case, the margin seems to be on the side of Judaism. Jesus may have taught many beautiful ideals, but unfortunately, he never seemed to be able to live up to them himself. Apparently, it was difficult for even Christ to be a Christian. Unquote. Jesus was actually in context contrasting the Pharisees' attitude towards the Gentiles with his own. The Pharisees of that time did not look on Gentiles with the highest favor and regarded them as inferior. Jesus, in fact, in the context, later blesses the woman for her great faith and grants her request for her daughter to be healed. This is found in Mark 7:24-30. Quote, Jesus left that place and went to the vicinity of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it. Yet he could not keep his presence secret. In fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an impure spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, born in Syrian Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. "First let the children eat all they want," he told her, "for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." "Lord," she replied, "even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he told her, "For such a reply you may go. The demon has left your daughter." She went home and found her child lying on the bed and the demon gone. Unquote. This is a far cry from Jesus being anti-Gentile. This actually demonstrates the opposite point that Kaplan is trying to make. I hope this article has been helpful to you guys. Also, I have written other articles that deal with other issues that haven't been covered by Kaplan. You can find them in the description below. Thank you for taking the time to watch.